We with one message from the Universal House of Justice. Indeed, from whatever direction we gaze, the power of Baha'u'llah's revelation is visibly at work in the world. For our next keynote address this evening, speaking on the power of Baha'u'llah's revelation, please welcome Stephen Birkland, member of the Auxiliary Board for Protection.
Thank you very much. It's a delight, as always, to be at Greenlake. I have a couple of things before we get started on this, on the content of the presentation for this evening, and that is to say that before the conference, this part of the conference ever started tonight, there was already a declaration. And so I wanted to welcome to our family Mr. Gregory Fox from New London, Wisconsin, and I'd like to give this to the BBC here. I also wanted to say that I know you'd want to know this, and I know that some of you may have heard that Mr. Sears hasn't been feeling very well at all lately. In fact, today he underwent some minor surgery. But I called just before coming over here and found out that he's out of the recovery room now and into the hospital room, and he's feeling good. And I mentioned that I would ask for prayers for recovery and health from all of you. Marguerite also said that that the nurses think he's the most wonderful patient. Everybody was laughing. It was done under local anesthetic, and everyone was having a ball, I guess, in there. But I'm not surprised. Friends, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about this preparation for the Holy Year as well. And it's a little difficult following Dr. Henderson, whose presentation was so eloquent and so, frankly, so comprehensive for only 45 minutes. But I'm going to take a little different tack. What I've done is I've gone through some of the messages from the Universal House of Justice that we've received in the last couple of years that have mentioned preparation for the Holy Year coming up. And I've excerpted certain words and phrases from them. I don't think we're going to get a chance to go through all of them, and many of them Dr. Henderson mentioned already. But there was a couple that I wanted to show you and talk about just a little bit. The other part of what I wanted to share this evening is this whole idea about what preparation for a Holy Year means and what this celebratory joy is like, this exquisite celebratory joy that the Universal House of Justice speaks of in their letters. And so, of course, as you might guess, I looked at the history books, the history of the Baha'i faith, and looked for times during Baha'u'llah's ministry since 1853, in which there were episodes where there was a great deal of joy and exhilaration and spiritual celebration. And I wanted to share just a couple of instances that I read about recently. So to get started, let me what I've done is just to make it a little easier, because they are so. Some of these are pretty big words, and I've had to spend some time looking in the dictionary, and Dr. Henderson admitted he did as well. He defined some of the words very beautifully this evening, but I wanted to just kind of flash them up on the screen so that you could integrate the visual as well as the oral or just listening to these words. So, Charles, if you would turn on the projector, and I'll show you a couple of the phrases that I wanted to refer to. Now, I'm not going to spend very much time on these, but the Universal House of Justice, as you can see, called this time, this Holy Year, which begins next Rizwan in 1992, a special time. A time to pause, as Dr. Henderson read from the House of Justice, a time to pause and appreciate the tumultuous record of events which will have brought us to the centenary of the Ascension of Baha'u'llah and to reflect with due solemnity upon the redemptive purpose of the life of the most precious being ever to have drawn breath on this planet. So we can see it's a time of deep reflection, but the House of Justice also pointed out, look at number 5 here, maybe you could raise that up a little bit, Charles. Look at number 5. The House of Justice pointed out that this celebration does not mean merely festive activities, but it's primarily a spiritual celebration. Now, I wanted to look a little bit at some of the other words that the Universal House of Justice, some of the other phrases that Dr. Henderson read, and ask you to consider what some of these might mean. If you'd go to the next one, Charles, I'd appreciate it. The Universal House of Justice wrote that this celebration does not merely mean festive activities. It is primarily a spiritual celebration and an occasion for deep reflection on the historic importance and uniqueness and meaning of and the efficacy of the covenant. Now, the Universal House of Justice wrote about a consciousness of the exceptional and glorious stage in humanity's spiritual evolution initiated by the covenant. They wrote of the awe such consciousness inspires and the thankful gladness it induces. And they mentioned that this consciousness and this awe are of the essence of the celebration. Friends, I wanted to talk a minute about this consciousness. This consciousness means somehow being conscious of the stage of evolution, becoming aware and understanding the stage of evolution that was initiated when Baha'u'llah ascended to the next world. The House of Justice said that the kind of meetings that we're going to have, auxiliary meetings, for example, not just the World Congress meeting, that we'll have the World Congress, which we'll hear more about and which Robert spoke so beautifully about, but the House of Justice mentioned that there would be auxiliary meetings that we would have throughout the planet, on all the different villages and towns and cities, that we would be planning meetings throughout the whole year, and that these meetings would be to inspire the same kind of, or to provide the same kind of time for reflection collectively as a community. Friends, during these meetings, I'm hoping that we can provide a kind of atmosphere, even in our own villages and towns, a kind of atmosphere that's going to generate this kind of awe. The awe such consciousness inspires, the thankful gladness it induces are the essence of the celebration intended. Both the World Congress as well as the Ascension of Baha'u'llah on the 29th of May. Now, the major purpose of these events throughout the year, the two major events and the auxiliary events that we'll have during the year, will be to evoke this solemn consciousness, this consciousness of what the covenant has done, what the power of Baha'u'llah has done. And that this solemn consciousness is the wellspring of the most exquisite celebratory joy. Boy, now I've never been through a holy year before, and so I don't know what it means even to prepare for a holy year. And thank God we've got the Universal House of Justice, which is giving us kind of a step-by-step on how to go about it. Now, the Universal House of Justice mentioned that, can you go to the next one, Charles? The next overhead? they mentioned that throughout this, that important throughout this period, the attitude of the Friends must reflect the significance of these two occasions, and that we must now orient ourselves to the significance of these twin anniversaries, that we must be spiritually prepared through prayer and the study of the teachings. The next one, please. So that we can obtain a deeper appreciation of the station and purpose of Baha'u'llah, the basic meaning of his mighty covenant, and contemplation of the peerless purpose, magnetic person, luminous character, and exemplary acts of Abdu'l-Baha. Now, these are some of the ways that the Universal House of Justice said that we will try to develop this consciousness. I think for now that's enough. You can turn the projector off, and I just wanted to share with you that time that I was talking about. I know it's getting late, but I just want to share with you a little bit about this time, this episode during the time of Baha'u'llah, when he was on earth, where there was a great deal of this kind of exquisite celebratory joy. It was a time, actually, before Baha'u'llah declared his mission. It was before Baha'u'llah left Baghdad. It was before Rizwan in 1863. Now, you know that during the time that Baha'u'llah was in Suleimaniye in Kurdistan, that the condition of the Babi community had deteriorated to a great degree. I mean, there was infighting, they were afraid to go out of their houses, people were insulting them in the streets, and they were cowering. There was none of that courage that you think about the Babi community, you know, Tahireh and Vahid and Quddus, Mullah Hussein and Ujjant and so on. There was none of that kind of courage. They were fighting and so on. I mean, things were just pitiful. Now, when Baha'u'llah came back, the enemies and the people that were giving the Babis such a hard time decided they'd do the same thing to Baha'u'llah. They decided they'd give him a hard time as well. And they knew him as a leader of the community. Now, the Babis had their, you know, they were sort of banking on Baha'u'llah coming back and reviving things. They'd actually sent somebody, the Holy Family had actually sent somebody to Kurdistan to retrieve Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah said he didn't come back because of that. He came back because of the will of God. He said that when I became a manifestation of God, I became like a leaf that just went wherever the winds of the will of God blew me. And so he said because of his love for the cause of the Bab, and because of the will of his creator, he returned to Baghdad. But instead of cowering in his house like the other Babis were, he started going to the coffee shops and walking in the street with absolute confidence and courage. In fact, the enemies decided they'd show him, you know. And so they sent this assassin to shoot him. They thought, you know, we'll take care of Baha'u'llah, and that'll, you know, increase the fear and so on, and we'll keep these Babis where we want them. So they sent this assassin to shoot Baha'u'llah right in the street. He came face to face with Baha'u'llah in the street, a gun under his coat, right? The minute he saw Baha'u'llah's eyes and looked into his face, he froze like a wet washcloth, right? The gun fell out of his coat onto the ground. He was a mess. Baha'u'llah told one of his servants, pick up the gun, give it to him, and, you know, show him home. I mean, that was sort of what happened when Baha'u'llah returned. And things got better and better and better after that. In fact, all the people that had heard about Baha'u'llah and his greatness and his insight and his wisdom when he was in the mountains of Kurdistan figured out that he'd left and gone to Baghdad, and so they all started streaming into Baghdad and telling the local folks what a great person he was, and so on. But Baha'u'llah, according to Shoghi Effendi, set about changing, single-handedly changing that community. You can read all about it in God Passes By. Shoghi Effendi said that Baha'u'llah not only emphasized, because he was in name, he was a Babi, he was not only emphasizing the teachings and laws of the Bab from the Bayan, he was emphasizing, according to the Guardian, and demanding actually from his fellow believers a standard of ethics which was what was greater actually than the laws and ordinances of the Bayan. A much higher standard. In fact, one of the things that he did that was interesting to me when I was reading about all the things that Baha'u'llah was emphasizing was that I ran across one of the things that he was emphasizing in these years before he even declared his mission was the acquisition of the arts. I thought about it after hearing the beautiful singers, the Indian drum, and the music from Mark this evening. I thought about that even before Baha'u'llah declared his mission, he was encouraging his fellow Babis to acquire and study the arts. Well, many other things, including improving their behavior, and it really had an unbelievable effect. Now, there were some believers during this time that Baha'u'llah allowed to see through the veil that he was a manifestation of God. To some degree, he allowed it. He even said in one of his tablets to one of the believers, in fact, it was Ahmad. You know, the tablet of Ahmad is written to? In another tablet to Ahmad, he mentions that he lifted the veil, or he pulled back the veil and let Ahmad see that he was a manifestation of God. Let him know a little bit about his station. So even before the sun came up, the sun of Baha'u'llah came up above the horizon, there were a few believers who had a glimpse of who Baha'u'llah was. And these believers I liken to, well, you know, when you're sleeping in the summer and you wake up early some mornings before the sun has come up, and you know that some of the squirrels and the birds are singing and the squirrels are moving around and so on, and the rabbits and so on. There's a lot of activity actually out there in the lawn, especially if you live where there are wildlife. There's a lot of activity even before the sun comes up. And it's sometimes beautiful to watch early in the morning, to listen to the birds singing. Well, this movement was a lot like what was happening in Baghdad. There were these believers who had gotten a glimpse of who Baha'u'llah was, and they were in another world in terms of their joy, in terms of their spiritual celebration of this time. It was unbelievable. Let me share with you just a couple of the things that Shoghi Effendi said about this time. He said that these people, he said the joyous feasts with which these companions, despite their extremely modest earnings, continually offered in honor of their beloved, the gatherings lasting far into the night. In fact, one of the things that they said, they had this little room, little tiny room. There was about 3 or 4 of them living in this room. There wasn't even any furniture in this room. In fact, Baha'u'llah said, let me find it here. Baha'u'llah came to visit that little room one time, and Baha'u'llah said that its emptiness pleases me. He said, in my estimation, it's preferable to many a spacious palace, inasmuch as the beloved of God are occupied in it, and the remembrance of the incomparable friend, the hearts that are wholly emptied of the dross of this world. That's how he characterized these people in their austerity. But what would happen was the amanuensis of Baha'u'llah, Mirza Aghajan, would get these freshly revealed tablets and poems that Baha'u'llah had just written or dictated to his secretary. And he would take them to this little house to transcribe them, but he would start chanting them as he did this. And these believers that were there, these are like freshly revealed tablets. You know how it is? Just imagine just a little, this is probably a pretty profane analogy, but you know how it is in the morning when you go to the bakery and you get the first bread out of there? You know? You're thinking, boy, am I lucky, I got this bread that's fresh right out of the oven. These people had these fresh tablets, right? Right from the manifestation of God, right to their little room, and they'd start chanting them at night. And one of them said that sometimes they'd come to, because they'd go into another world, you know. They'd come to, and it would be noon the next day. Shoghi Effendi said that they were fasting. They were singing the praises of the Bab, Qudus, Baha'u'llah. One of the things that they did that was very interesting was, you know, Baha'u'llah at this time was encouraging them to transform their lives in certain ways. And in certain ways, he was encouraging them to transform their lives. I mentioned earlier about what he was emphasizing. Here's what Shoghi Effendi said. He was emphasizing godliness, kindliness, humility, piety, honesty, truthfulness, chastity, fidelity, justice, sociability, amity, and concord, the acquisition of art, self-sacrifice, detachment, patience, steadfastness, and resignation to the will of God. And these believers, because of their attachment to Baha'u'llah, and because of the leadership of Baha'u'llah, they did some unbelievable things. One of the things that they did was they made an agreement between them. Okay, we're talking about people like, let me see, I wrote down some of the names of some of the people that I remember from this time. There was one fellow named Pedar Jan. I should tell you just briefly about Pedar Jan. This guy was like a helium balloon. He was always sort of up there, you know. And they had to make a living. They didn't hardly have a thing, you know, to eat or to wear. In fact, they said that whoever went out could claim that the coat on their back was their own. And whoever went out just took the shoes closest to the door and left. Because they really didn't even have enough clothes to go around. Well, they tried to make a living, okay? And so one time they got some socks. And they decided to go into the market. They got some socks, so they went into the marketplace, and they were going to sell these socks. And so they gave some to this guy named Pedar Jan, right? And they draped the socks over his arms, and they said, now go into the marketplace and sell these, and we'll make a little profit, and we'll have enough to eat. Well, he would start chanting these poems and tablets of Baha'u'llah and just go up like a helium balloon, you know, and the people would steal the socks. And so he'd come back empty-handed. And they'd say, oh. So the next time they sent him out, they put the socks in his hands, all right, clenched fist, and sent him out. But again, the same thing. He'd start chanting these new poems, the hidden words. Can you imagine the 7 valleys? That was this time, the Katagi Khan. He'd start chanting these things, go off into another world, and the people stole the socks right out of his hand. They finally gave up on him. There was Mirza Agha Ahmad, I mentioned him. There was another guy named Muhammad Mustafa Baghdadi. He was the only Arab apostle of Baha'u'llah. Now this guy, the image I have of this guy was, you know these Mexican banditos, you know, you see in the movies, the caricature of them, how they have the bullets, you know, and the knives and everything. That's the kind of image I have of this Mustafa. It's probably not a very good image, but this guy was bad, as they say. Nobody messed with Muhammad Mustafa. He had knives, guns, the whole thing, and he was one of the staunchest Babis in this community, and he loved Baha'u'llah. You know, the moment Baha'u'llah said not to harm anyone, told the Babis to put down their weapons, he was the first to take all the knives and guns and everything and lay them down, never touched them again. He did it instantly. Instant obedience. But he was still bad. Let me tell you, people still feared him because he didn't take crap from anybody. And what I mean by that is that, you know, they used to ridicule the Babis in the street. I met his grandson one time, and his grandson, this is kind of a pilgrim's note of a pilgrim's note, but his grandson told me that when he was 16, he went to visit the master with his whole family in Akka. And he said that Abdu'l-Baha sat all day, all afternoon, and told his whole family stories about Muhammad Mustafa Baghdadi. He said one of the stories that he told them was that there was a Babi who had been walking in the streets in the marketplace, and somebody had really ridiculed him, and not only that, insulted the name of Baha'u'llah. And so this guy, he was smart, this Babi, went running to Muhammad Mustafa, because he had that reputation, you know, for taking care of those things. And so what happened was, Muhammad Mustafa walked back. He said, "Show me the guy." So he walked back. Now this is the pilgrim's stone. He walked back with the Babi, and he said, "Who is it?" And the guy was just going out of his shop and into another door. And he said, "He's over there. He's right there down this alley here." And Muhammad Mustafa said in a loud voice, "Is that the one?" You know, just real loud like that. And then turned around and started walking away. And the Babi said, "Well, aren't you going to do anything?" And he said, "Go back and look." He went back and looked, and the guy was dead of a heart attack. Now, like I said, it's a pilgrim's note, but it gives you an idea. A pilgrim's note of a pilgrim's note, actually. But it gives you an idea of the kind of people that were around Baha'u'llah at this time. They were fearless. And before this, they were hiding, locking their doors, afraid to go out on the street. Now with Baha'u'llah back in town, they were fearless. And they were like these people. There was one, Nabil Akbar, Nabil Azam, the one who wrote the Dawnbreakers, you know, that gave us this history. Let me just share with you something that Nabil Azam wrote. He said that so intoxicated were those who had quaffed from the cup of Baha'u'llah's presence that in their eyes the palaces of kings appeared no more ephemeral than a spider's web. He said, "Many a night, no less than 10 persons subsisted on no more than a penny worth of dates. No one knew to whom actually belonged the shoes, the cloaks, or the robes that were to be found in their houses. Whoever went to the bazaar could claim that the shoes on his feet were his own, and each one who entered the presence of Baha'u'llah could affirm that the cloak and robe he wore belonged to him. Their own names they had forgotten. Their hearts were emptied of aught else except adoration for their beloved. Oh, for the joy of those days, and the gladness and wonder of those hours." That's the kind of gladness and joy that I'm hoping will create during this holy year. And we need to start preparing. Well, one of the things that these folks, one of the things that they did was that they decided to make a pact. I'm not advocating this, but they decided to make a pact among them, all right, that if anybody used a profane language or got into conflict with another Babi at that time, or anything like that, that they said they exercised care in sanctifying and purifying their souls, that they would suffer no word to cross their lips that might not conform to the will of God, nor would they take a single step that might be contrary to his good pleasure. In fact, they entered into a pact with each other, these Babis did, that if anybody violated this, that the other one agreed to admonish him and chastise one another with blows to the soles of their feet, a number of blows according to how grave the violation was. All right? And just to give you an idea of their attitude about this, if they did something wrong, that they felt was against the will of God, and they had some punishment coming from their fellow Babis, and the fellow Babis said, "That's okay, let's let it go this time." They said that what they would do is that they would not consent to eat or drink until they suffered the punishment. That's the kind of spirit they had, folks. And they became transformed. In fact, one person, you've heard of the beloved of the martyrs and the king of the martyrs. There was one person among them. His name was Zabi. Baha'u'llah called him the king and beloved of martyrs, and said that no blood had ever been shed on this earth as pure as his. He was a holy man. He was very learned. And he used to take off his turban every morning at dawn and sweep the dust off the steps in the front of Baha'u'llah's house because he said, I don't want anyone else stepping on this dust after the Blessed Beauty stepped on it. And he would put it into his cloak and take it to the river and throw it into the water. That was a self-appointed task of humility. One time he became so overwhelmed. The ocean of his love for Baha'u'llah was so overwhelming that he performed this task one last time. He went down to the river and he laid down with his head facing, after performing his ablutions, he laid down with his head facing towards Baha'u'llah's home, and he took a razor and cut his throat, and then laid the razor on his chest and died. And a whole bunch of other people decided they'd do the same thing, and Baha'u'llah had to stop them. That was the kind of devotion and love they had at that time. The authorities couldn't believe that that it wasn't a murder. And when they figured out that it was a suicide for that reason, the credibility and the awe that they had for Baha'u'llah was increased tremendously. Well, what I'm thinking about now is how are we going to prepare for this holy year? And what kind of meetings are we going to have during this holy year, these auxiliary events that we'll have in our own villages, in our own towns and counties and so on, that will try to evoke this consciousness, this kind of consciousness. What they had was what? The freshly revealed tablets. And what the Universal House of Justice is saying is that we must prepare through prayer and reading the tablets and reading the stories about the life of Abdul-Baha. Now, one other thing that these folks had, they didn't have a lot of distractions. They didn't have a lot of distractions. They had this little house that the roof was falling in, they said, and they didn't have any furniture. And I'm thinking that how can we make these meetings during the Holy Year very special meetings? I read recently in a letter from the Universal House of Justice about the 19-day feast that they said important aspects of preparation of the feast include the proper selection of the readings, the assignment in advance of good readers, and a sense of decorum both in the presentation and the reception of the devotional program, attention to the environment in which the feast is to be held, whether indoors or outdoors, greatly influences the experience. Cleanliness, arrangement of the space in practical and decorative ways play a significant part. Punctuality is also a measure of good preparation. I can only imagine that as Baha'is, as we have meetings to prepare for the Holy Year collectively, as we have meetings throughout the Holy Year, to evoke that kind of consciousness of the power of this covenant that will be the wellspring of that exquisite celebratory joy. If we really want to experience that joy that these believers did, and look what they did afterwards. If we want to do that, maybe what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to leave work early and go home and take a shower and take a nap and eat so that when we go to that meeting, we're not going to be all dragged out from the day and tired and stressed out. Maybe we're going to have to make sure that those rooms are especially clean, that the environment will evoke that kind of, that will have music, that will do everything. We're going to really have to be creative because no one's ever done this before. Most of us in this room for a holy day. And this is an event, like Robert mentioned, that'll never happen again this year. Imagine, it's really going to thrust us into this next century, going 150,000 miles an hour. And we've got this opportunity, but it's going to require preparation. But the celebration is going to be a spiritual celebration. So our preparation is going to have to be spiritual. Maybe we'll make some pacts with each other. I tell you what, I'll make a pact with you right now. If you see me doing some things that aren't Baha'i-like, don't tell me about it or beat my feet, okay? But sit down immediately and say a prayer for me, all right? And I'll do the same for you. Probably I'll be sitting around here for a long time, but then you know what? We'll get tired of sitting, and we'll say so many prayers that it will launch us spiritually, right? Back to our homes. Is it a deal? Friends, the one thing I want to mention in conclusion is that the Universal House of Justice, in their infinite wisdom, knows about us and our capacity. That's why they're always encouraging us to do more and more and more, because they know that we have such great potential. But one of the things that they did was that they gave us a beautiful booklet called Baha'u'llah. Many of you have seen this probably. The National Spiritual Assembly arranged for it to be published in large letters in the American Baha'i a few issues ago. So we all have it, and we've all seen it, and hopefully we've all read it. But the Universal House of Justice gave this for a couple of reasons. Hopefully we'll talk more about it this weekend, but there's tons of them for sale up at the bookstore. And I wanted to mention that because the House of Justice said we can use these for two reasons. One, of course, is to proclaim and blazon the name of Baha'u'llah across the globe. But the other is, in preparation for the Holy Year, and taking advantage of the Holy Year to evoke the meetings, to evoke this kind of consciousness that will be the wellspring of that celebratory joy. The Universal House of Justice has given us this to study. They had their Office of Public Information write about the ministry and the purpose of Baha'u'llah in just a few pages. And so it includes beautiful, eloquent descriptions as well as quotations from the writings of Baha'u'llah. And I encourage all of you to buy one and begin studying it and underline it and write in the margins and do everything you can to try to evoke that consciousness and that appreciation. This is the time. Let me close by reading one quotation from the writings. Baha'u'llah wrote, "It is in our power, should we wish it, to enable a speck of floating dust to generate in less than the twinkling of an eye suns of infinite, of unimaginable splendor, to cause a dewdrop to develop into vast and numberless oceans, to infuse into every letter such a force as to empower it to unfold all the knowledge of past and future ages." Well, I hope you'll take this time during these the next day and a half to try to evoke this consciousness of the purpose and the power of Baha'u'llah's covenant to really change the world. Thank you, guys.